Great to be here. Thank you, Joyce. That was extremely generous. It's wonderful to be here at the Clinton School talking about Africa, why it's more important to the United States. I think it's particularly apt to be at the Clinton School talking about this because President Clinton was by far the first U.S. president to recognize this trend. What I'd like to talk to you about today is, I hope you take away three things. First, that Africa is, even though it seems very far away and is historically not as connected to the United States as, say, Latin America or Europe, that it's becoming more important than ever before, and that it's not just because of Ebola and Al-Qaeda. The real story is actually a positive one of economic opportunity for the United States. The second takeaway is that the United States, our government at least, is not yet ready for this new reality. We're not responding as quickly as we should, and we're not taking advantage of these opportunities as well we should. And then third, since this is a school of public service, I'd like to encourage especially the students that working on Africa is a terrific career choice. It's definitely a growth area. And then I want to end by telling you why would I talk about all this stuff through a fictional book? Why tell the story through a thriller rather than through another academic or policy book? So I want to talk about the risks of Africa. I'm going to talk about the opportunities, and I'm going to talk about the U.S. response, risk, opportunities, and response. So Africa, I know many people, when they think of Africa, they have some image in their mind. Maybe it's, I don't know, Ethiopian refugees from Live Aid, or Rwandan genocide, but for most Americans, it's something very negative. It's also something that seems sort of stuck in the past. Africa, China is booming. We visit Europe, it's changing. Maybe we go to Mexico, and 10 years later, it's a lot different. Well, Africa also is moving almost as quickly as anywhere in the world. I go to Accra in Ghana at least once a year. And it looks different every time I step off the plane. There's that much construction, activity, vibrancy. So it's a place that's actually changing very rapidly, even if the image for most Americans, and particularly in our media, is not changing so quickly. But there are a number of risks out there that impact everyday Americans. It's not just Africa policy nerds like me. First and foremost, the United States will always have humanitarian interests in Africa. We've made a major public investment in fighting AIDS in Africa. We've made a major effort to try to reduce conflict, to eliminate famine. And we've seen the American public start to get more and more involved. The American churches were hugely responsible for the AIDS program that we have now. And even some things that you could make fun of as being sort of frivolous social media, like on Twitter, have actually led to real impacts. So I don't know if people remember the hashtag Kony2012. I don't know if people remember that. Well, that was a social media campaign to get the U.S. government to do something about a Ugandan warlord. Now, he had been creating trouble in that part of the world for at least 20 years, but it took a social media campaign for the White House to deploy special forces to Uganda and Central African Republic. A little over a year ago, Bring Back Our Girls, about the Chibok kidnapping in Nigeria. Again, social media played a major role, and again, that led the White House to deploy U.S. Special Forces to Nigeria. Anyone see a pattern developing here? But the point is that it's not only these humanitarian concerns that are drawing the U.S. We have real hardcore U.S. national security interests in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is because the nature of the threats that the United States faces around the world is changing. a lot of the new threats are about hidden transnational networks. These can be terrorist networks, these can be international criminal cartels, these can even be international cross-border disease vectors. And in all of these, Africa is becoming more and more relevant. The US military calls this ungoverned spaces. These are physical areas where governments can't control the land, and that's exactly where the criminals and terrorist networks go. And that is a concern for the US military. We've certainly seen a rise in terrorist groups in Africa. Going back to 1998, where al-Qaeda groups bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, we've now seen in 2009 on Northwest Flight 253 from Amsterdam to Detroit, there was the famous underwear bomber on Christmas Eve. He was from Nigeria. We had the northern half of Mali taken over temporarily by international terrorist groups. There was a seizure of the Algerian gas facility. There was the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, and then just a few days ago, this absolutely horrific attack on Garissa, on the University of Garissa in Kenya. There are also several very well-organized and increasingly dangerous groups, like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which carried out the attacks in Kenya, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, which had kidnapped the girls and is now spreading over the border into the region. And then northern Mali, if you think of an ungoverned space in the world, the middle of the Sahara Desert is almost a prototype. And this was an area where the Malian military couldn't go. There aren't very many people there for obvious reasons. But when Algerian jihadists were getting pushed out of Algeria, they migrated down into Mali, integrated with some local groups, and wound up creating a lot of havoc. There's also something I don't think people talk about as much, because in a certain sense, this is more of a European problem than an American problem, but Africa is increasingly part of the international narco-trafficking networks. So heroin coming from Central Asia is coming through Africa into Europe. Cocaine from Latin America is coming through West Africa into Europe. Now you may say, well, that's a European problem. Drugs aren't coming into the US, they're coming into Europe. But what that's doing is the presence of large drug dollars is they're undermining the governance of all of these countries that we're working with on health, on counterterrorism, on economic development. And the flood of drug money, the corrupting effect of drug money can be quite debilitating. But the sum of this is that the US government is getting drawn into very complicated partnerships with governments in all corners of the world. And this is not something that's going to go away. Our national security interests are going to be more and more tied to the likes of Nigeria, Senegal, Kenya, Ethiopia. These countries are going to become increasingly important national security partners for us. So now that I've scared you about horror and chaos, the real story is good news. It's that African economies are actually doing extremely well, more than 5% real GDP growth per year over the last decade. Some of this is because of decent prices for commodities. There's definitely a lot of oil and gas and mining going on in Africa, but that's actually not driving the majority of the economic opportunities in Africa. This is actually a services-driven boom. We're talking about IT, banking, retail, trade. Even in a country like Nigeria, which is the biggest economy in Africa, it is an oil economy. The oil sector is actually not doing very well. It's relatively stagnant. It's growing a little bit. But the economy is still growing at 6 to 8% per year because these other sectors are pulling it along. So 6 to 8% per year might sound nice, but sort of abstract. Why would American companies care about Nigeria growing at 8%? Because Nigeria is going through a remarkable once-ever transition right now. Average incomes in Nigeria is somewhere around $1,000 per head. But what's happening is that this year, 2015, somewhere between 5 and 10 million families in Nigeria will enter the lower rungs of the middle class. And what this means is people are they're making this transition that we made several decades ago, or in some cases a century ago, where our families are buying the first refrigerator that our family has ever had. They're buying the first motorcycle, they're buying the first television, sending that first child to university. And this is having a tremendous effect on consumer demand. So, General Electric, I don't know if there's a more prototypical American company than GE. GE is super excited about Nigeria. They're putting billions of dollars into electricity, into railways, into healthcare, into all the sectors that GE invests in Nigeria. They've invested over $1 billion in a plant in Calabar. And I'm going to guess that with the exception of Joyce, no one in this room has ever heard of Calabar. And that's exactly the point, that Nigeria has about a dozen cities with at least 1 million people that your typical American has never heard of. And these are cities that are on the move, they're booming, and the consumer demand is just absolutely tremendous. We saw this with cell phones at the sort of lower end of the consumer spectrum. We're now starting to see this in white goods, in transportation, in IT services, banking services, and it's this explosion. And once families make that transition into middle class and they start educating their children and buying a refrigerator, very rarely do they go backwards. They go forward. And it's not just Nigeria. I talk a lot to private equity investors, emerging markets private equity investors. They are super excited about Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya. A lot of these markets are growing. Rwanda, which it's a tiny little country in the middle of Central Africa. People still think of the 1994 genocide. Rwanda issued a Eurobond not that long ago. It was 4 times oversubscribed. So there is the financial market community, also a tremendous amount of excitement in Africa. And what you'll see if you have the lucky chance to go to cities like Nairobi or Accra or Lagos or Johannesburg or Dakar is that these are not villages. These are huge, bustling centers of both commerce and culture in a way that I think challenges our traditional views of what Africa is all about. Ebola, I think, is a particular problem that cross-cuts a lot of these issues. On the one hand, it was a humanitarian disaster that got the White House to deploy the U.S. military. It was a national security issue. If you remember those days where that nurse contracted Ebola in Dallas and the absolute panic that went on in the U.S. And it was also, leading to my third point on response, it was a case study in very, very slow response by the U.S. On the one hand, yes, we wound up sending the U.S. military to Liberia to build these Ebola treatment centers. We committed about $4 billion. Congress actually had a special appropriation of about $6 billion. $4 billion was for Ebola treatment centers in the U.S. We had less than 10 cases in total, so you can do the math on that, and about $1.5 billion for Africa for dealing with Ebola. We built these 18 units. About half of this was in the New York Times maybe 2 days ago. About half of those units never saw a single Ebola patient, essentially we arrived after the crisis was over. We arrived too late. We pat ourselves on the back, which is what we should be proud for what we did, but we really did it about 3 months too late. And I think that's just indicative of how slow response on our part actually makes us both not deal with the risks and also miss out on opportunities. So response, how are we doing? How is the US government reacting to the new Africa, to this Africa that has these new security threats and these new economic opportunities? So I just want to make a couple of structural points about the US government and our foreign policy. So the first one is that we have lots of interests. If we tried to come up with what kinds of US national interests do we have in the world, we could probably collectively come up with a list of at least 100 things that we care about. Many of these things are going to be in conflict with each other at a particular time and place. We want to fight terrorists. We also want to promote democracy. Okay? In Egypt, those come in direct conflict. In fact, the more that I'm watching, and this partially as an outside analyst, partly as a former diplomat, conflict is actually the norm. It's not the exception. We as the United States have lots of interests because of who we are and who we think we are. A lot of these are value laden, and I think that's positive. That's who we see ourselves as and what we want to project in this world. But it is often going to come in conflict. Second is that our government itself is huge. It's almost mind-bogglingly colossal. I worked in the State Department, which is a mid-size agency of the federal government. I worked in a corner of the State Department called the Africa Bureau. Not the biggest part of the State Department. We do have 45 embassies in Africa, so there's some staffing needs for 45 embassies. Would anyone here like to guess how many employees there are of the Africa Bureau of the State Department? A small corner of a medium-sized agency? Anyone want to guess? 1,500, okay? 1,500. And so what this means is, in policy-making terms, you have lots of agencies, okay? We want to decide what do we do about Ebola? Well, you have state, you have USAID, you have Health and Human Services, you probably have the Treasury Department, you have DOD, you have the White House. If you're talking about the economics, you can add Commerce, Labor, EPA, Interior, right? Lots of agencies. They're all huge. And it all adds up to when you take lots of interests, lots of agencies, and lots of people, you get a lot of crossed wires, should we say. And I'd say it works well, US foreign policy works well when we're very clear on what our goals are in a particular case, and what are the trade-offs against some of our other interests. So when she was Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton talked about the 3 Ds of foreign policy: defense, diplomacy, and development. Now I work on development. That's the shortest leg of the stool there. And it was always talked about as if these 3 things were mutually supporting. And in fact, again, this is the exception rather than the rule. There's something, the government still to this day talks about something they call whole of government. For Ebola, we had a whole of government approach. We were going to bring all the capabilities of all the agencies together to try to tackle a particular problem. Well, inside the Beltway, we spell whole of government without the W. And this problem of lots of people, confused mandates, conflicting mandates, and no clarity about what are priorities, this has all been especially bad in our policy towards sub-Saharan Africa because there have traditionally not been very clear national security or very clear economic interests. Where you do get that, say, with Mexico or with parts of the Middle East, where, yes, we want to support and encourage democracy in the Middle East, but that is clearly not the first-tier agenda. Now, those are the structural bad, the context that I think is is a problem. The positive sign is that Africa, as it's becoming more important and recognized as more important within our government, we're starting to see some of these priorities start to shake out in a better way. Now, President Clinton, if you think about his Africa legacy, he had something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It was a piece of trade legislation that essentially cut U.S. tariffs on imports from Africa. That is still, to this day, that was passed in 2000, 15 years later, that is still the basis for our trade relationship with Africa. It has broad bipartisan support, and it's an important legacy. I'd say it's President Clinton's most important legacy in U.S.-Africa relations. Then President Bush came to power, and I don't think anyone expected him to do anything on Africa. He had nothing in his history that suggested he would, but he actually also built a pretty good Africa record. He launched something called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It was a major investment in helping to halt AIDS in Africa and start to reverse it. Again, built with strong presidential leadership, like AGOA, strong presidential leadership and broad bipartisan support in Congress. President Bush also launched something called the Presidential Malaria Initiative, lesser known but also pretty effective. He launched a new agency called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a new federal agency that makes grants to only high-performing, good governing countries. And then right at the end of the Bush administration, they also stood up a separate combatant command within the military called AFRICOM, the Africa Command. Prior to that, Africa was a kind of appendix to the European Command, run EUCOM. So they reorganized, since we had so many military activities going on, they reorganized into a separate combatant command called AFRICOM. So both Presidents Clinton and Bush recognized that we were getting more involved in Africa, we were going to have to start to reorganize ourselves, and they started pushing sub-Saharan Africa up the ladder. President Obama came to power, and expectations were tremendous. His father was from Kenya. His advisors talked a very, very ambitious game about how they were going to build on the Clinton and Bush legacies, really take it to the next level. The first term for President Obama arrived. It was complete dud. He spent less than 24 hours in the entire first term in the continent. He essentially flew into Ghana, gave a speech to Parliament about how good democracy is, and left. He launched 3 White House initiatives that were relevant for Africa. He launched a clean energy initiative that was announced but never implemented. He announced something called the Global Health Initiative, which was supposed to turn the AIDS initiative into a health systems initiative. That was abandoned before the end of the first term. And then he launched something called Feed the Future, which was supposed to promote food security. And that took about 2.5 years, 2.5 to 3 years to get going. It's still with us. It's kind of limping along. It's not bad. I highly doubt it will live beyond 2016. So what we have not seen in the first term of President Obama's tenure is anything like AGOA or PEPFAR that will last. The good news is that the second term for President Obama has been a pretty big and dramatic turnaround. The Ebola, I'm critical of the slow response time to Ebola, which was it was a big effort, but it came way too late. The president made a real trip to Africa in the summer of 2013. He visited 3 countries, and while he was in Tanzania, he announced something called Power Africa. It's a big U.S. government initiative to help bring electricity to Africans living without. Right now, 2/3 of Africans live without electricity. And electrification is a development strategy in the US, it was a development strategy in Asia, and it's a development strategy in Africa. And this is an effort to bring together all the US tools to try to help boost electricity on the continent. He also held a summit last summer. I don't know if people noticed it here in Arkansas, but he brought, for the first time ever, nearly 50 heads of state to Washington for a big summit to talk about the future of U.S.-Africa relations. China's done this for years. The Europeans have done it for years. This is the first time an American president did it. And I expected a circus, and of course summits are always a circus, but actually the summit was a huge success. And it was a huge success because, in my mind, because the top two agenda items were things that both the Americans and the African leaders cared about. It was national security cooperation and boosting private investment. And that's the reason that Power Africa, which comes out, unlike the first three initiatives from the first term, which were literally cooked up in the basement of the Eisenhower Executive Office building by White House staff, Power Africa came about because White House staff, in particular Mike Froman, who's now U.S. Trade Representative, kept hearing from African leaders, yes, this is fine, we're happy with the agriculture program, health program, we want to work on electricity. And so the White House staff was responding to what they were hearing from partners that we were asking a lot of in other spheres, and they helped bring together Power Africa. Now, we don't yet have bipartisan congressional support. I'd say there's a good chance we'll get legislation this year, but it's by no means assured. But we are seeing some pretty positive progress on electrification. So those are the risks, the opportunities, and the iffy response so far by the US government. So I thought I'd end by saying, well, why would I talk about all of this in a commercial thriller? Okay, so I've written my fifth nonfiction book is coming out in May. I'm a academic policy nerd. That's what I normally do. Why would I bother writing fiction? So the first reason, which is the most important, is that it's way more fun. It's more fun to write, and I thought if I wanted to share some experiences about what's it like inside U.S. government, why is Africa becoming more important, why not do it through fiction? It'd be more fun for people to read, and I would reach much, much bigger audience. So fun is really the main reason. I like to read thrillers when I'm on vacation. I think a lot of people do. Second is I did want to share my love of Africa. Joyce mentioned that my first foray there was Zimbabwe as an exchange student in college. I was just shocked when I got off I'm from Rochester, New York, middle-class kid with no connection to Africa whatsoever. Got off the plane in Harare, Zimbabwe. I'm 19 or 20, and I had no idea what to expect. I kind of thought it was going to be like Mars. And when I got off the plane, I was just shocked because it was so familiar. It just seemed so normal. My family that I lived with were 2 teachers. They had 4 kids, and we talked about sports and traffic and school. It was kind of like being back home in Rochester. There's also something special about it. You'll meet people, particularly, you'll meet Americans, maybe former Peace Corps volunteers or former exchange students. They will get what we call the Africa bug. That's not malaria or Ebola. That is a lifelong sort of personal attachment to the region, and people go back, they get hooked. I got hooked right away. The second about less than a week after I graduated from college, I went right back to Zimbabwe, spent another year backpacking around. I've since been to 22 countries. I had this unbelievable kind of freak accident opportunity to work inside state. While I was there, I was what's called, only in government do you get a title like this, Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. And I had 16 countries. We had 15 embassies in West Africa. Got to travel all around Nigeria. We were helping rebuild the Liberian economy and their military from scratch. There was a coup in Mauritania in 2008. I was the lucky person that got to go meet with the general who had just arrested and deposed the president, President Abdullahi, who had sat right next to President Bush at a global democracy forum only a couple months earlier. I got to work on Mali, where we had major counterterrorism cooperation exercises going on, travel all around Mali. It was an amazing experience. And I wanted to share some of, the Africa love by writing a commercial, mainstream thriller that would just treat Africa like any other region. Most thrillers used to be about Europe, now they're all about the Middle East. Well, why not set one in Africa? The third thing I did want to do is take readers, regular readers, inside this sort of sausage machine of US foreign policy making. So virtually every day there's some crisis in the headlines. Somebody's been kidnapped, there's a coup in Thailand, there are riots in Cairo. And I wanted to take readers inside the White House Situation Room or into some classified room in the corner of an embassy and hear all of the agencies and parts of the US government argue over what the hell we should do over a long table. So I wanted to try to bring that so that maybe people would think, when there's another crisis, they think, why are we reacting slowly, or why are we doing this? That doesn't make any sense, that they'd get a little flavor of that. So I created this character named Judd Riker. He's a college professor from Amherst. Comes up with this theory called the golden hour, which is that the golden hour comes, I used to drive an ambulance in Boston, comes from emergency medicine, major trauma victim. If they don't see a doctor within an hour, their chances of survival plummet. My fictional character finds the same thing happens in international affairs. If a war breaks out, you don't stop it within 2 weeks, your chances of stopping it plummet. If there's a coup, if you don't fix it within 4 days, you don't reverse the coup, your chances of ever reversing that coup plummet. And so he has this idea that after a coup, you have to reverse it within 100 hours. So he pitches this, my fictional character pitches this at the State Department, and they say, wonderful, you're hired. We're creating a new unit called the Crisis Reaction Unit, and you're in charge of getting us to respond more quickly. Well, what does our hero Judd Riker find is that the State Department wants none of it. Nobody invites him to meetings, nobody will listen to him, he's completely iced out until, by accident, there's a coup in Mali. And I used the Mauritania coup in 2008 as a sort of template for this. I thought, I'll put it in Mali instead of Mauritania because nobody's ever heard of Nouakchott, Mauritania, and everybody has heard of Timbuktu, right? That's not the capital of Mali. It's a real city in the north. It's a beautiful, amazing place. I thought, I'll put it in Mali. Actually, Mali was doing pretty well. It was a democracy. It was growing. I thought, it seems pretty good. I'll put it there. And so our hero, Judd Riker, after the president of Mali is deposed in a coup, he has 100 hours to try to reverse it. Just so happens a Peace Corps volunteer has been kidnapped outside Timbuktu, and the embassy in the capital, Bamako, is on alert because there's a new terrorist threat, new terrorist cell that we have intelligence is about to attack the embassy. And I tried to just make this sort of a fun, accessible window into what does the US government do in these situations. Now, I had a problem, though, when I finished writing this book, is that I wrote it, I started writing in 2009, I was pretty much done by early 2012, and I started shopping it around to agents, and in fiction, you need to have an agent to go to a publisher, and I kept getting the same message back. Oh yeah, this is interesting, but it's Africa. Africa's not commercial, it's not mainstream. American audiences don't want to read thrillers set in Africa. One actually asked me, why not move it to the Middle East? So I decided I wouldn't do that. Well, what happened then is that Mali had a real coup. And the northern half of the country, there was a coup, again, sort of an accidental coup. Then the northern half, in the chaos of post-coup Mali, groups of terrorist groups, including some called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, had taken over the northern half of the country. Now, this is mostly desert, but it's an area the size of France, and they started marching toward the capital, Bamako. This is pre-ISIS, so there hadn't really been a time where an Al-Qaeda-type jihadist group had taken over an entire region like that. there was an agent in New York who likes to watch BBC News. He was watching BBC News late one night with his wife, and they were watching French troops fighting Algerian terrorists in Mali and why the US government was getting all worked up about it. And they thought, what is this? We didn't know anything about this. And he thought, wait a minute, I have a manuscript on my desk about terrorists in Mali. And he went and read it, and 3 weeks later, we had signed with Penguin. And it's not just that Penguin, I'm not an anomaly. They actually, my publisher is the Putnam House within Penguin. Putnam alone has 4 thrillers now set in Africa by other authors. One of the new James Bond, Solo by William Boyd, is set in a fictional Nigeria. And Putnam liked the Mali story so much, they've given me a 4-book deal. So the second book, so The Golden Hour, is set in Mali. It came out last September. So the next 3 Septembers, I'll have new books coming out. This September is a book called Minute Zero, which is about Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. And then book 3, which is with the publisher, this will be out in September 2016. So actually, I was thinking, I sat back, it was a little over a year ago. Okay, I had the Mali. I didn't predict it, but me making up the story of a coup in Mali not coming true helped me there. Zimbabwe I had to write about an aging dictator who's trying to steal an election. Maybe I can make something happen there. That'll give you a little hint of what happens. Then I thought, okay, well, what's a country that's ripe for change that I could think about a similar type thing? And I don't want to be only Africa all the time. So I thought, Cuba. So I started writing the story about Cuba, and I think I was about a year or 2 late. But the book is about Cuba and the politics of South Florida, and that's delivered. We don't have a title yet. And now I owe my editor next month an outline on book 4, which I think will be Nigeria. I haven't convinced him I can do that yet. But the idea was really to just try to bring a little bit of flavor to why Africa, why would it matter, why could it be fun and mainstream. And those of you, if you read it and like it, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from people. The one thing I just want to end on is that I've been amazed. First of all, writing nonfiction books where you really put your heart into a book, and then you realize how few people read it. When you write fiction, you realize how many people read fiction, and the response is so positive. But I've really been struck by how broad the audiences are for thrillers. So I'm speaking here at the Clinton School. Last October I spoke at the Bush School. That's you'd expect that kind of broad support. But I had an amazing day a couple of weeks ago where I got to go to the Central Intelligence Agency and do a book talk for the staff. There's some CIA characters in the book. And of course they loved it. And I got in my car and drove out the George Washington Parkway, around the Beltway, and then out into rural Maryland. And then I gave a book talk at a Quaker school, and they loved that. And so that was, I think, an amazing example of how you can reach people through what you wouldn't have expected to be a possible new format. So thank you.
Thank you, Todd. We do have time for a couple of questions, and
Sure.
Raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Nordine, coming behind you.
Thank you for coming. I'm actually a neighbor of Joyce's. I'm from Benin, so I know Nigeria very well.
Great.
So you mentioned how much Africa is becoming very important in global peace. Especially, my concern is about the drag coming from other places into West Africa, and then from there to wherever they are supposed to take it. It has caused a lot of problems, especially in countries that are struggling to be very strong. And a few years ago in Guinea-Bissau, actually the president or one of the higher was assassinated, and it was related to drug issues. What's America or the rest of the world doing about that? Because the cross-Atlantic Ocean, you have the submarines, you have all of that. Is there any Anything being done on that?
So, yeah, I mean, that's why I was mentioning the narco trafficking problem is becoming much worse, and it's not really a drug problem. It's actually a problem of organized criminal cartels. You know, it could be anything. It just happens in this case to be drugs. But when you bring, you know, Guinea-Bissau, a small country in West Africa, was a narco state. I mean, the government was taken over by drug traffickers. But drug money is so big and it's so hidden that it penetrates every country in West Africa. It penetrates large parts of East Africa. And if you're talking about a low-income country with weak government and somebody arrives with suitcases of cash, it's not that difficult to disrupt things. What do we do about it? Well, on the European side, there's a demand issue. They treat that as a public health problem. We're not very good at it, right? We're not good at it in our own backyard, and we're certainly not going to be good at it in the Mediterranean zone. The thing that I'm actually worried about most of all is that we view it we take an overly militarized approach to it. If we view counter-narcotics as we do counterterrorism, and we decide we're going to deploy drones and train counter-strike teams throughout West Africa, I suspect that we're going to do a lot more damage than good. So I don't have any great insights on that, other than it's something that clearly the Europeans have to take the lead on that. But it's undermining. If you think about our relationship with Kenya right now, having the corruption in Kenya is the cancer that undermines the effectiveness of that government. Same in Nigeria. If we're counting on them to work with us in a number of areas, and yet their military is involved in drug running, how are they possibly going to be credible partners of ours? That's really the problem. So, sorry I don't have good answers for that. Thank you.
Hey, my name's Wallace Smith, and I work with an engineering firm that is very soon about to, believe it or not, kick off some infrastructure projects in Libya. We're also in turn even going to be hosting some government officials from Libya back here, right here, actually in Little Rock. I was just curious, all right, Africa's your specialty.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular thoughts on Libya and where we're going? Or do you want to try to talk me out of trying to do a project there?
So in military world, Libya is part of Africa. In State Department world, Libya is part of Middle East, North Africa. So my region, I didn't deal directly with Libya. And, one of the sparks of the chaos in Mali is that paid soldiers for Gaddafi had, after the collapse of his regime, they left with all of their weapons and went back to Mali, and they were well organized, well armed, and they had nothing to do. And they helped to really bolster the forces that created that. So Libya is very, very integrated into all of the problems and the economies that I'm talking about. I do not have great insights on what's going on in Libya. When you said the government is coming, my first question is sort of which government? So, I think that it will shake out. We do not have great levers there, partially because of the isolation that was there over so many years. The horrific death of Ambassador Stevens is going to make us even more reticent to get involved. Clearly Libya is going to put tons of money into infrastructure projects, and there's a tremendous amount of potential there. But until the politics get sorted out, it's going to remain extremely dangerous and just very, very volatile. I'm sorry I don't have any specific advice. The one thing I would say is that in an environment like that, you want to just be very careful. And this is true, everywhere. You just never, when you're doing business deals in Africa, the classic mistake that companies make is they get really tight with one politically connected person. And I guarantee that that person's political connections will come back to haunt you in the life of the project. So you never want to be too attached to someone's political fortunes. So, I mean, the classic one is you hire the president's son or nephew to be part of your management team. But if you're doing infrastructure, if you're just doing day trading, that's fine. But if you're doing an infrastructure project, there will be political change in the life of that project. So you want to just manage that. So I'm sorry, that's not that.
I know there's so many questions, and I hope that you'll come up and talk to Todd after. I know it's getting close to the end of this at lunchtime, and so I want to let people get back to work. Todd, thank you so much for coming. A special thanks to Ambassador Eastham from Hendricks, who helped us do this program, and he'll be going there this evening. But please do come up and talk to Todd, and thanks for coming.
Great, thank you.